Welcome to an insider's perspective on the outlook for transportation in 2014. This webinar is hosted by the Ports to Plains Alliance and Move Colorado. The Ports to Plains Alliance consists of over 170 members, cities, counties, economic development organizations, chambers of commerce, and businesses in a region serving the United States from Texas on the south to Montana and North Dakota on the north, including 10 states, as well as the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan and Mexico. Ports to Plains is a grassroots alliance of communities and businesses whose mission is to advocate for a robust transportation infrastructure to promote economic security and prosperity throughout North America's energy and agriculture heartland. Move Colorado is an organization focused on the issue of adequate funding for Colorado's transportation system. That organization is composed of member organizations, companies, and public agencies. My name is Joe Kiley. I'm the Vice President of Operations for the Ports to Plains Alliance and also serve on the Board of Directors for Move Colorado. Our presenter today is Jack Schenendorf. Most of you have seen Jack's extensive background as a staffer for the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure for 25 years, including 6 years as Chief of Staff. Jack is one of the most respected transportation experts in the country, and he represents the Ports to Plains on federal transportation matters. We're going to ask you to save your questions to the end, and we'll answer as many as time allows. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available. And so at this point, Jack, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Joe, and I appreciate this opportunity to tell everyone a little bit about what I think is going on in Washington with respect to transportation. And it's fairly complicated and confusing for most people, and so what I've tried to do is simplify this as much as possible, but still give you a sense for what some of the key issues and problems are. Let me start by saying that we're going to in this presentation, we're going to really have 4 parts. We're going to talk about where we are today, how did we get to this point, what are the options for moving forward, and what do I think the outlook is for transportation this year. Let's start with where we are right now. And the big picture for our transportation network in the country is that every study, every commission that's looked at this has come to the same conclusion, and that is we are underinvesting in our infrastructure when you look at the expenditures of all levels of government and the private sector. And unless we increase the investment, our transportation network is going to be a drag on economic growth and on international competitiveness going forward. So we need to find a way as a nation at all levels of government and the private sector to up the investment in transportation if we're going to remain competitive and if we're going to have a strong economy. Currently, the legislation that's in place is known as MAP 21. That's moving ahead for progress in the 21st century. That was the transportation bill that passed in 2012. It's a 6-year policy bill. There was a lot of policy changes in there, a lot of reform, a lot of project delivery, accelerating project delivery. But the bill only had 2 years of funding because they couldn't really come up with sufficient revenues to fund the full 6-year bill. And that funding goes out to, in the highway program, goes out to mostly to the states, for the states to use on funding highways in that state, and also some of the funding goes to transit entities for transit systems both in rural areas and in urban areas. The funding for MAP 21 expires on September 30th of 2014, So something has to be done before that date in order for the program to continue into the next fiscal year. The biggest problem that's facing the program that affected MAP 21 and is the reason there was only 2 years of funding, and now in moving forward to try to provide funding for the future, is that the Highway Trust Fund is in serious trouble. And there are really two problems, a short-term problem and a long-term problem. They're really distinct problems, but related. The short-term problem is that in MAP 21, there was enough money put in the trust fund to reach September 30th. It turns out that those estimates were wrong and they didn't put quite enough money into the trust fund. So it looks as though the trust fund is going to run out of money before September 30th. And what that means is that Congress is going to have to act and do something before the August recess in order to prevent checks from being bounced from the trust fund. And I don't think in reality checks ever would be bounced, because I think what the Department of Transportation will do is to basically slow down the reimbursements of states and local governments, and in order to make sure that the trust fund has enough money to pay the bills through the end of September. Well, that can cause a real hardship on state and local governments if they're not being reimbursed the way that they normally are under the program and in the way that they typically rely on. So this is a problem that is going to need to be addressed. It could become politicized. The infrastructure investment is something that the Obama administration has focused on, and as we'll talk a little bit later on how this could play out, this could become politicized, but whether it is politicized or not, it still is a problem that has to be dealt with in the short term. In the long term, the problem in the Highway Trust Fund is it simply cannot sustain even the current levels of investment, much less the increased levels of investment that we talked about before that are necessary to support a growing population and a thriving economy. There are two ways to look at this long-term problem to kind of get your head around, you know, what is this problem? And the first is to say, okay, what would the level of spending be that the trust fund could support? If it can't support the current levels of spending, what levels could the Highway Trust Fund and the user revenues that it collects, mostly from the gas tax and the diesel fuel tax, what level of spending could it support? And the answer to that is it's about 30 to 40% below current levels of funding. So the program would have to be cut over the long term about 30 to 40% of where it is today in order to be able to sustain the program on the existing levels of funding. In this graph, you can see then that if 100% of the funding, current funding is in 2014, you can see that it would have to come down about 30 or 40%, where the green represents what the trust fund can support, and the white portion of the graph in 2014 is really the spending that's over and above what the trust fund can truly support. AASHTO has put out this chart to try to show it in a dramatic way, that if you didn't do anything, the funding would have to come way down in 2015 and then it would go back up. I don't think Congress would really ever let this happen. What they would do is to even it out at a 30 to 40% reduction in order to make sure that there wasn't any draconian drop like that in the program. To give you a sense of the impact that this could have, this is a chart that ARTBA put together, And what it shows for each state is the percentage of the state's capital investment for highways and bridges that's coming from the federal government. As a national average, it's about 52%. But if you look at state by state, it's different. So for an example, in Texas, about 40%, 47% of the capital investment in highways and bridges that Texas made is federal funds. New Mexico, it's about 70%. Colorado, 64%, and so on. And you can see, so if there's a 30 to 40% reduction in federal funding, and then you look at how much federal funding is of the state program, you can see that a reduction in funding of that magnitude would have a significant reduction on capital investment in the states. There's another way to look at this problem too. Instead of saying, okay, well, let's just cut the program back to what the trust fund can support, you can look at it another way and say, okay, let's maintain current levels of spending. We should be spending a lot more, but we at least want to maintain the current levels. We don't want to have a reduction in funding. And so what that creates is really there's a hole in the trust fund, and the question is how much more revenue do you have to put into the trust fund over and beyond what the current user fees are providing in order to maintain the current levels of spending. And the answer is to that, to fix the short-term problem we talked about this year, you need a few billion. You would need about $19 billion additional put in the trust fund to have a one-year reauthorization bill. You'd have to have about $35 billion for a two-year reauthorization bill, and you'd need about $100 billion additional put into the trust fund to have a six-year reauthorization. That's roughly equivalent to a 10 to 12 cent gas tax increase. So we're talking about a big hole that's going to take a lot of money just to maintain current levels of spending. So that's kind of where we are right now. And the question is, how did we get here? We're going to talk about options for fixing it and what the kind of prognosis for what's going to happen. But I do think it's worth spending a little bit of time just saying, my gosh, how did this ever occur? How did we wind up in this position where we need so much additional money and where our investment is really not adequate and the system is deteriorating? Well, I think there are three factors that I would mention. The first is that the Highway Trust Fund has suffered a real loss in purchasing power. There's been no increase in the gas tax, which is where the trust fund gets most of its money from. There's been no increase since 1993. And AASHTO put together this graph, and you can see here that if you go back to 1993 and you go to where we are now, there's been about a 35 to 40% reduction in the purchasing power. And if you project out to 2022, there would be about a 50% reduction in purchasing power. So obviously that's one reason why the investment that's being made isn't getting the job done. There's a second reason, though, and that is that the actual number of dollars flowing into the trust fund from the gas tax and diesel fuel tax are declining. And there are a number of different factors involved. The VMT actually dropped for a while, and the rate of growth now is slower than it's been in the past. People aren't driving as much. The vehicles that they're driving get greater fuel efficiency than they did before, so for every mile traveled, there's less fuel being used. And there are now alternative fuels where other things are being added to gasoline so that you, again, don't have as much gas being used, or alternative fuels of a different type are being used. And then you have alternative vehicles, the all electric vehicles that don't use any gas that are out in the road. So for all of these reasons, the actual amount of revenues coming from the gas tax is not increasing the way it used to and is actually declining somewhat because of the fact that as much gas isn't being used. And over the long term, this problem is going to only get worse. The third reason we're in this position, and this is a big, big part of the situation that we find ourselves in, is that up to the time when Safety Lou passed, which was the big transportation bill before MAP 21, and that passed in, I guess it was 2005, 2006, in that time frame. The basic situation with Safety Lou prior to Safety Lou was that every time there was a bill that was came out for a new transportation bill, because vehicle mile travel were increasing, the bill could be bigger than the previous bills. And when we got to Safety Lou, that has started to flatten out, and they really couldn't write a bill that was much bigger than in the past. And there was all this pressure to make increased investment. All these commissions had come forward, and reports were out saying that we're not investing enough, we need to invest more. And so the House Transportation Committee tried to get a 5-cent increase in the motor fuel tax, and the Bush administration said no. And it was very frustrating because members, states, stakeholders like yourselves were all out there saying we're not investing enough, we need to invest more. Everybody agreed on the need to invest more, but of course if the trust fund is going to support higher levels of funding, you have to put more money into it. And nobody was willing, or at least the Bush administration was not willing to make the increased investment in the program. And so what they did in Congress, and this was a deliberate decision, they really leveraged the Highway Trust Fund spending to an unsustainable level for the long term. And they basically funded the program out of Safety Lou at a level that they knew couldn't be sustained and that it would take a tax increase to maintain it. And that was a deliberate decision by Congress, feeling that when Safety Lou then expired, Congress wouldn't want to reduce the spending, and so therefore that would force them to increase the gas tax. I like to use an example because I think it just explains to people, gives them a better sense of what was happening. Let's say you had a salary of $24,000 a year. On average, that means you could spend $2,000 a month. Let's say you had $6,000 in your savings account, and so you decided to spend $2,500 a month. You're going to spend your entire salary and all of your savings. At the end of that year, after spending $2,500 a month for 12 months, something has to change. Either you have to get a salary increase so that you can continue to spend the $2,500 per month, or you have to cut back your spending to $2,000 a month, which was your actual salary because you've used up all your savings. This is exactly what was done in Safety Lou. They spent more than the trust fund could support in the long term. At the end of Safety Lou, there was a decision that had to be made. Do we want to cut spending, or do we want to find a way to put more money into the trust fund? And the hope was that that leverage would lead to a gas tax increase. And so that's how we got to this situation. And since Safety Lou has expired, it was a series of extensions which led ultimately to MAP 21. And during that period, basically there has been an effort to maintain the current levels of spending, which means that Congress had to find other ways to put money into the trust fund. And so now we're in a position where the 2 years in funding and MAP 21 are over, and to go forward, we need more money for the trust fund. So the question then is, what are the options out there? What can Congress do about this? And this is the part, in a way, that gets very confusing, because there are a lot of revenue options thrown out that people talk about, and it's very important to have in your own mind a way to kind of look at them to see exactly where they fit into the big scheme. So let's start with this quote, which I love. Gentlemen, we have run out of money. It's time to start thinking. And that's the position that we're really in right now. We really have to start thinking about what the options are, and then how to analyze them. The first way to deal with this problem is to basically pass the buck, is essentially to say, well, this is a huge problem for the federal government. Politically, it's difficult to deal with. So let's, instead of actually dealing with it, let's kind of turn it back to the states. Let's let the states figure out how to raise the additional money. That way we don't have to make the tough choice. The ultimate aspect of this would be devolution, to really get rid of the whole federal program, and turn it all back to the states, let the states handle it, let the states figure out how to raise the money. And we can repeal the federal gas tax, because we won't need the federal gas tax anymore. And so we can cut taxes for people. And so from the view of some federal legislators, boy, this looks very attractive. We get rid of the problem. We can be heroes with the public because we cut the gas tax, and the states are perfectly capable of handling this. My own personal view is this is not the answer, and although there are, kind of a growing number of members talking about this, that it's based on the false assumption that the states could pick up that load, could really raise the amount of money that was necessary, and that all of the states would act in a coordinated way to make sure that the national system was upgraded. I believe this would lead to a balkanization of our national system, because some states could make the investment, other states couldn't, and even the states that could make the investment, their priorities might not always line up with the priorities that are important at the national level. So let's say that, okay, devolution is one way to deal with it, but let's not go down that path. And let's look at some of these innovative financing options. And what you're going to hear is there's a lot of talk about public-private partnerships. There's a lot of talk about tolling. Let's give the states the authority to toll the interstate system. There have been proposals to have a federal tolling of the interstate system. Infrastructure banks, TIFIA, which is a credit assistance program, tax credit bonds, private activity bonds. The Delaney bill takes some repatriation funds and uses it for infrastructure investment. And there have been other innovative financing options out there as well. These are all worthwhile options. They're all part of the overall solution. They can supplement the funding that comes to the states from the Highway Trust Fund. But these options do not provide any money specifically to put into the Highway Trust Fund to fill the hole we were talking about. And so you really, it's imperative to keep one's eye on the ball here. What we have, as we've been discussing, is a shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund. There's a hole there that has to be filled with real money in order to support even the current levels of funding. All of these innovative financing techniques, while again worthwhile and part of an overall solution because they can supplement what comes from the trust fund, none of these actually put money into the trust fund itself. And so these aren't really part of the highway trust fund solution options. These are just supplemental techniques that can be used on an as-needed basis. Which brings us really to the tough choices. These are the options that actually generate more money for the Highway Trust Fund, and there are a number of those that are out there. A gas tax increase is one of them. A general fund transfer is another approach. And then there are a number of other activities that could be utilized. And let's start with the everything else. What else is out there that people are talking about that could generate money for the trust fund? Well, one you hear a lot about is the vehicle miles traveled. Convert over to a vehicle miles traveled tax, that could generate a lot of money, that would have a lot of advantages in the minds of some, and could be a replacement for the gas tax as we go forward, because as we talked about before, at some point the gas tax isn't really going to be a good measure because of all the alternative vehicles, alternative fuels and the like, that over time it's going to become less and less important as a generator of revenue for the trust fund. And vehicle miles traveled is a very legitimate thing. It's quite controversial. It has privacy aspects to it that have to be overcome. The public reaction, the political reaction to it has not been positive, at least at the outset. Both commissions, the commission I served on and the Financing Commission, both of which had been set up by SAFE-TLU to come up with options, both recommended moving toward a vehicle miles traveled approach over time, and to go forward with demonstration projects and the like to see how it works. The thing to remember about vehicle miles traveled is that while it theoretically is a good replacement, even for the people who completely embrace it and say this is the greatest idea ever, vehicle mile traveled is not going to be ready to put big amounts of money into the trust fund for many years. So even if we said, yes, this is what we want to do, this cannot generate revenues in the short term, in the next 5 to 10 years, which is what we're talking about. We're talking about a reauthorization bill we're trying to get done by September 30th. So vehicle miles traveled cannot generate revenues in the time frame that we're talking about, and frankly, it's going to be, at my judgment, at least 10 years before this is ever a potential source of revenue for the program in any big way. You look at oil royalties, that was discussed in the context of MAP 21. People said, let's expand the amount of drilling that we do offshore. Let's take some of the royalty money and put it in. Again, this could be a decent source of revenues for the Highway Trust Fund, but again, it's not something that's going to put money in the trust fund in the short term, in the next 5 years or so, in any significant way, because even if you went down this path, you've got to wait till all of this additional development takes place and actually is moving oil that can then have royalties on. A repatriation is another possibility. Now, it's not a user fee. It's really a general fund thing. This is where corporations that have money overseas, that they bring that money back to the United States, and an incentive is that they're taxed lower than they would be normally. And so the money that's derived from them bringing that money back could be used. Delaney has a bill where he uses it for some new investment in various types of infrastructure. Theoretically, that money could be taken and put into the Highway Trust Fund. That's a possibility. We'll talk a little about that later as to why it's not all that likely to happen. Another option is to index the motor fuels tax to inflation. That's a great idea. I mean, that should have been done in 1993. But even if we do that now, well, it would be very helpful and it should be done, it's not going to generate enough revenue over the next few years to fill the hole in the trust fund. If we shift from an excise tax, which the gas tax is today, to more of a sales tax approach, again, that's something that in theory could work if you raise the sales tax high enough that it would actually produce more revenue than the excise tax, but the politicians have been unwilling to do that because of the fact that they don't want to raise the taxes, the same problem they're having with the gas tax. Customs fees is another possibility. Take part of the existing customs fees and put it in the trust fund. The Ways and Means and Finance committees, for a variety of reasons, have been very reluctant to do this, and so it's not too likely. And of course, there are other fees that could be looked at. So a lot of the things that are out there that actually could generate more money for the trust fund, when you actually look at them carefully, you see that they either can't do it in the time frame we're talking about, or the amount of money that they generate starting now wouldn't be sufficient to fill these big holes that we have in the trust fund that we saw before. So that these options really won't get the job done when looked at carefully, because they can't generate enough revenue in the period we're talking about. I included this, so just you have it for a resource. This is a chart that Ashto put together that has all sorts of different types of fees that the federal government could impose, and you can look down those. Most of them are either don't generate enough revenues, or again are increases in significant fees, and that's been the problem, is the inability of Congress to be able to come to agreement on how to raise taxes in today's political climate. So that brings us to the first of the options that could actually generate the money that's needed, and that's a motor fuels tax increase. It's an existing user fee. There are many advantages to it. Again, you can go look at the commission reports that I referred to before, and they lay out all of the pros and cons of all of these options. Both national commissions recommended it. The Revenue Commission recommended a 10-cent gas tax increase. The Policy Commission I was on, we recommended a 5 to 8 cent gas tax increase for each of 5 years, which would total a 25 to 40 cent tax increase. The Simpson-Bowles Commission that the President set up to look at the long-term fiscal condition of the nation recommended a 15-cent gas tax increase, all of it invested in transportation. And so there's a lot to be said on the merits for, if you're going to have to raise more money for the trust fund, that the motor fuel tax is actually the best way to do it. But it's politically, it's something that the Republicans and Democrats have not been able to bring themselves to raise, and there just hasn't been the political courage to do it, even though privately many members will tell you they realize that that's what needs to be done. So the people who are saying, well, we need more money in the trust fund, they realize that, you know, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, the gas tax is probably the best way to get significant amounts of money, but even if you come up with other ways, you're still raising fees of some sort. Most of those people who are in that mode are looking at the tax reform bill or the so-called grand bargain that does not only tax reform but also looks at entitlement reform as being the kind of a big vehicle that's out there that would be doing making a lot of changes, where you could have an increase in the gas tax or an increase in some other fee for transportation that would be sufficient to fill the hole in the trust fund, maybe even have increased spending for the trust fund. And in a big package like this, it would really almost be buried, where there would be so many other changes going on that people really wouldn't be focusing on it the way they would if it was a standalone. That was the case with the Simpson-Bowles Grand Bargain. You know, you heard a lot about that, but the fact that it had a 15-cent gas tax increase in there really wasn't talked about all that much. And so most people who are looking for a strategy as to how to get more money for the trust fund look at the tax reform effort and the Grand Bargain effort as being the kinds of bills that would be able to carry the increased investment for transportation. So if we can't do the gas tax increase, then what else do we have that can generate the kind of money we need? And another approach is a general fund transfer. Just take the money out of the general treasury, even though we're borrowing that money today, take it out of the general treasury, but also have an offset that reduces spending somewhere else to basically cover it and balance it out so that it doesn't increase the deficit. And this has actually been the solution that has been used since Safety Lou. Ever since Safety Lou expired, as we said, it was basically at a level of funding that couldn't be supported. So to continue the extensions and to continue MAP 21 at current levels, the only way to do that is to fill the hole, and the only way they could agree to fill the hole was with this general fund transfer. In the white box, you can see the general fund transfers that have taken place to date. It's over $53 billion. You can actually fill a hole of any size in the trust fund. It's only limited by the offset you can come up with. The offsets tend to be controversial because it means some other program is being cut, something else is being cut, and whoever the supporters are of the something else raised objections. Another aspect of it that's not good from a transportation perspective is that it takes us away from user financing. It's general fund money. The Highway Trust Fund actually funds these programs through what's known as contract authority, which means that you don't have to wait for an appropriation. The states can rely on the funding that's provided in the authorization bills because it's backed up by a user-financed trust fund. Well, the more general fund money we start putting in there, the longer we go relying on general fund money, then the more likelihood there is that at some point we lose the highway trust fund, we use the user financing status, and then we're competing with every other federal program out there that gets money from the Appropriations Committee, and we can't provide states with the long-term assurance of financing that we can today, which means states are going to feel like they can rely less on the federal government, and so they may not be willing to make the commitments at the state level. The only practical solution, at least in the short term, going forward here. So what's the outlook? Where do we think this is going to go from where we are right now? And just to recap quickly where we stand, MAP 21, the funding in that expires September 30th, so something has to be done by then or else there'll be no money going out to the states, which I think is unacceptable to members of Congress. They certainly don't want that to happen, especially in an election year. And of course, it's, would be the wrong thing to have happen just on a perspective of policy. The other issue to come back to, just a reminder, we don't actually even get to the September 30th problem on going forward for the next fiscal year. We actually run out of money in fiscal year 2014 before September 30th. And so this is important because this means Congress is going to have to do something before the August recess. And again, that could become quite politicized if the administration sends up some notice saying this needs to be fixed in June or July, and we're ready to close corporate loopholes to do it. And, it's the Congress that's holding this thing up. And so, where do we where do we go from here in trying to get everything done. The first thing is the program is in very good hands. I mean, Barbara Boxer and Bill Schuster have proven that they are leaders. They both are very engaged in fixing this. Barbara Boxer distinguished herself in the MAP 21. That bill, in my judgment, would never have made it to the president for signature had it not been for her. She was really the driving force behind it. Bill Schuster's in his first Congress as chairman of the House Transportation Committee. He got a WRDA bill out, Water Resources Development Bill, passed the House 417-3, something people didn't think was possible in this Congress, so he's proving himself. And the two of them are dedicated to getting this program back to working and to getting the financing fixed. So the program is in good hands with them. Senator Vitter is the ranking member on the Senate side. Congressman Ray Hall on the House side. They're all full partners in this. And so both the Republican and Democratic leadership in the Senate and in the House on the committees are working arm in arm to try to get this problem fixed. Both of the committees, the House Transportation Committee and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, are working hard on the reauthorization bill that they would want to put in place. As we mentioned before, MAP 21 really was about 6 years worth of policy, and we're only 2 years into it, so it's still being implemented. I don't think you'll see major changes to MAP 21 because it's still being implemented. I mean, it was a 6-year bill from a policy perspective, so I don't think Congress is going to go back to the drawing board and just wipe out the reforms that it made in MAP 21 and kind of start over. So I think the focus will be more on fixing problems in MAP 21. If there were things that came up that are problems or the administration isn't implementing something the right way or a mistake was made, you'll see those kinds of fixes. And then there are two other areas to watch for. One is, while there were some very good provisions in MAP 21 on speeding up project delivery, there were members who felt as though more could have been done, and so I think that this bill might be a vehicle for doing some of the more might have been done types of provisions. And then secondly, there was a disappointment in MAP 21 over the National Freight Program. Really, there were some skeletal things put in, but there really wasn't the kind of focus and resources that people were hoping for, and so an expanded effort in the freight area would be something to look at. And both committees are in the process of holding hearings and starting their preliminary work to get these bills out and ready to go to the House and Senate floor this spring and early summer. But as we've been talking about, funding is still the big problem, and Boxer and Schuster don't have jurisdiction over that. They've been basically saying we want to keep all the options on the table, we want to look at everything, and somehow find the money to fill the trust fund and hopefully even raise the trust fund beyond, so it can fund beyond the current levels of funding. But they really have to look to the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee to do that, because they're the committees that have jurisdiction over the funding part. And it's kind of a unique position that they're in that Senator Baucus, who had been chair of the Finance Committee, was made ambassador to China, and so Senator Wyden has now stepped in, so Senate Finance Committee has a new chairman who's trying to find his way and get acclimated to his new responsibilities. And on the House side, the House Ways and Means Committee, Chairman Camp is in his last year as chairman. There are term limits in the House. You can only serve as chair for 6 years. His time will be up. The next Congress will have a new chairman of that committee. And so he will basically is in his last year, and so the combination of having a new chairman at finance and a really kind of a lame duck chairman at Ways and means that it's not going to be easy for them to figure out how to deal with the financing for this bill. And again, what we need is at least several $billions to fix this short-term problem, and then if there's reauthorization bill were a one-year bill, you'd need $19 billion, $35 billion for a two-year bill, and about $100 billion for a six-year bill. And that's a lot of money. And so how are they going to come up with that is the $64,000 question. Most people do not see any one of these big budget bills. We talked before about maybe the way to do this if you have to raise the gas tax or you have to do something equivalent to that in the way of new user fees for the trust fund, is to put it in a tax reform bill or to put it in some sort of grand bargain. Well, those things are not going to happen before the election. I don't think anybody sees tax reform or a grand bargain passing before the election. So the kind of vehicle that we had been hoping could be used to produce the kinds of revenues being talked about here, it just isn't going to happen before the election, and so that's a problem. There have been some positive signs. All the signs aren't negative about this. Chairman Camp, when he realizes that tax reform is unlikely, he nevertheless has put out his own tax reform proposal. This is something that really the House leadership wasn't that excited about because tax reform isn't going to happen this year. Why put out a proposal that then just stirs up some controversy? But nevertheless, in that proposal, he recommended that there be $125 billion put into the Highway Trust Fund to support current levels of spending. That would be about 7 years or so that you could support the current levels with that $125 billion. And he would get it from repatriation funds, which were part of his tax reform proposal, changing the international system for taxation, and that would generate some additional money coming back to the United States, and he would use that to put into the Highway Trust Fund to stabilize it. So that's a positive sign. It's positive that he recognized the problem the trust fund has, positive that he came up with a lot of money to put into the trust fund. Again, repatriation fees aren't user fees, but it's better than just simple general fund transfers. And so his proposal does have some positive aspects to it. The president sent up his 2015 budget. That calls for a $300 billion investment package for surface transportation over the next 4 years. That's about an 18% increase over the funding today. So from a funding point of view, that's very, very positive for transportation. Although when you look at the 18% increase, a lot of that money is going to non-highway related transportation. So for those of you who are just interested in, mostly interested in the highway expenditures, there's only a small percentage increase in highways. Most of the president's increased spending goes for other transportation modes. And the way he does this is to basically come up with about $150 billion from what he refers to as corporate tax reform to pay for it. Doesn't identify which aspects of the corporate tax reform, just the general corporate tax reform. Of that $150 billion, about $78 billion of it is to fill the hole. In other words, it took about, for a 4-year bill, would be about $78 billion that's needed to fill the hole. The other $72 billion is for that 18% increase over and above current levels of spending for the next 4 years. So that's a positive proposal. Again, it recognizes not only the need to fill the trust fund, but it also recognizes the need to increase spending over and above what it is today. So those are positive things. Again, though, this corporate tax reform isn't really identified exactly which pieces it would come from, and it would also be a non-user fee. And again, as we talked about before, the preferable way to finance spending for the trust fund is through user fees. So both of these proposals, both the president's and Camp's that are out there, both fix the trust fund by relying on something that's happening in tax reform. Again, we said that though the tax reform is unlikely to happen before the election, and it's unlikely also to be split into pieces. You know, looking at Camp's proposal, one might say, okay, we're not going to get tax reform done this year, but let's do the repatriation piece and take that money and put it in the trust fund. Can't we break that out? And the answer is yes, you could break that out as a separate item, but it's unlikely to happen because for people that want tax reform to be a priority, want it to be a priority, had wanted it to be a priority this year, certainly would want it to be a priority in the lame duck session, would want it to be a priority in 2015. They want tax reform to happen. Well, the way to try to make tax reform happen is to make sure all of the reform is in one big bill. So you build up a big bill with a big coalition behind it that's pushing it. If you start breaking the pieces off and passing a piece here and a piece there, then you wind up basically diluting the strength of your effort, and that makes tax reform harder. And there are a lot of also of, as you're doing tax reform, the pieces, there's a lot of balancing those pieces out. They fit together like a puzzle. And again, if you take one out and do it first, it just kinds of upsets that whole effort. So if one concludes that tax reform isn't going to happen before the election, and it's unlikely that they would split tax reform off into pieces, then both the Camp proposal and the Obama proposal don't really hold out much hope for getting money before September 30th to move a reauthorization bill before that point. So how does this play out now in just kind of a straightforward way? The committees are going to move forward with their multi-year bills. So I think they'll continue to hold their hearings. They'll be drafting. They may release things. They could start going to markups or considering them. But they're going to continue to be stymied by this lack of a highway trust fund fix. They can't come out with a bill that has no numbers in it. They have to put numbers in there. And if they put numbers in there that are the current level of spending, then they need big dollars to do that. As we mentioned before, for a 6-year bill, that's $100 billion. And so they would need that as their bills move to the floor, and it's not clear where that money is going to come from before the election. And so the committees, as they move forward here, could very well find themselves stymied because of the fact that there's no path to getting the big amounts of money that are needed for the trust fund before the 2014 election. In addition, they've got this wrinkle of the current program not being able to make it to September 30th. So as summer approaches, they may be kind of stymied to a degree on their multi-year bill, and yet as the summer approaches, the pressure's on to pass a bill that fixes the short-term highway trust fund problem so that they can at least get to September 30th. And they still won't most likely have a long-term fix. I mean, I certainly hope there's some breakthrough and somebody figures out how to do this. But, you know, I think the odds are right now, I think most people feel like they're not going to have that long-term fix in hand by summer. And also, as we mentioned before, this could become quite politicized, potentially, depending upon how it's handled. And so they're also going to start feeling the pressure of, my gosh, we have to get something done by summer, at least on the short-term problem. So if, as Congress moves in this position where they have to do something by the August recess, then you start looking at what their options could be. And they could say, okay, let's do the short-term fix. Let's figure out how to get a few $1 billion, and we'll do the short-term in a separate bill. And then we'll figure out in September how we're going to get the reauthorization bill done. And so in this option, Congress would have to act twice. They'd have to get a general, most likely a general fund infusion into the trust fund before August, some sort of small offset, and then they'd turn around, and a month or two later, they'd have to be coming back with either having found the long-term fix for the trust fund, which is unlikely, or coming back with another general fund infusion of some sort with another offset. So that's one option. They could go down that path. They also could go down the path of saying, well, let's not try to do this twice. You know, it's hard enough. We don't know where we're getting our long-term money. Let's just do a 3-month fix to the end of the fiscal year. We'll fix the short-term problem. We'll put in 3 months worth of money. That gets us to the end of December and through the election. And when they come back from the election, maybe we can figure out a way at that point to do something and get the long-term authorization done in the lame duck session. They could also say, well, you know, if we do 3 months, then that means that we, you know, have to come up with the money now for the 3 months, and then most likely in the lame duck, we've got to come back with another extension of some sort. And, you know, the more extensions you have to come back with, the more difficult it is to get the money, and people start, you know, getting tired of this. And so maybe it's not a wise idea to do a 3-month extension. Maybe we're to do a 6-month fix and give ourselves the first 3 months of 2015 as well. And so if we can fix it in the lame duck, great, but if we don't, we have the first 3 months of 2015 to try to get things done. And there, you know, it would be another way to think about it. Now, there'll be some people out there that say, listen, we can't get this big money that we need for the trust fund unless it's part of a big tax reform and or grand bargain effort, that we need a big bill that Congress is working on that solves big problems, and in that context we can get the kind of revenue we need for the trust fund, hopefully not only to fix it to support current levels, but to fix it so that it can actually provide increased investment going forward. And if we're going to want to do that, then we're going to have to hope that a tax reform bill or grand bargain bill comes up in 2015. And it's not, if it is going to happen, it's not going to happen in 2015 in the first 3 months. It's going to take longer to get that kind of a big bill through. And so maybe we ought to just give ourselves a 1-year fix. You know, $19 billion is a lot to come up with, but it's easier coming up with that than it is $35 billion for a 2-year bill or $100 billion for a 6-year bill. So let's just come up with the $19 billion, do a 1-year extension, and give ourselves all of 2015 so that we can hopefully get ourselves included in a tax reform or grand bargain. And I think most people would think if a tax reform and grand bargain are going to pass in a presidential election cycle, it would almost certainly be in 2015 and wouldn't spill over into 2016. Close you get to the presidential election, the more difficult any big bill like that becomes. So there are people in Washington who think that 2015 things might be lining up finally to do one of these big challenges, tax reform or a grand bargain, and that's where we get the money for transportation. And so let's do a one-year fix and give ourselves that year. So that's the kind of options that Congress would be looking at as it approaches this August recess. Now, could there be a miracle and they figure out some way to get a gas tax increase or to get a general fund infusion for 6 years or to come up with some other fee to raise $100 billion over the 6 years? I hope it does, but I think that the longer people look at it, the more unlikely it seems that before the 2014 elections, something big like that can be done. And so if it can't be done, then you're going to start seeing yourself come down this kind of a path that I just described here, where you're going to have to do something in that short-term bill. And then when you're doing that, you're going to be saying to yourself, my gosh, how many times can we come back and do this? Shouldn't we maybe get our extension at the same time? And then how long should that extension be? And how much time should we give ourselves to get the MAP 21 reauthorization bill finished? So that's what it's going to take. It's going to, I think everybody's waiting for when these two political parties are going to be able to do some things together and to say there are some issues that have to be solved in the national interest, and the two parties have to come together and work out a compromise on these areas. And I don't think anybody knows when that's going to be. I think people have been hoping it would have happened by now, but it hasn't. There are a lot of people that think it will be in 2015, but I guess we're just going to have to wait and see. But anyway, this is how I kind of see it playing out in 2014 as Congress grapples with where to come up with the financing to take this program into the future. And that is the real problem right now. It isn't on the policy side. I don't think Boxer and Schuster will have any difficulty coming to agreement on the policy portion of the reauthorization bill. The real critical path is where do we get the money to pay for it. And so with that, I'm available for questions.
Jack, two questions. The first one is Congress looking at a way to tax alternative fuel vehicles?
I think they are. I think as the different fuels come up, they would be looking at a way to tax that at the equivalent. I think a lot of the effort, though, from the transportation community and from DOT is on the vehicle miles traveled. That's one of the arguments for a vehicle miles traveled approach, in that it doesn't matter what the fuel of the vehicle you're using is. It doesn't matter whether it's gasoline or electric vehicle or natural gas or fuel cell. You're paying based on the miles that you drive. And so you do capture all of these vehicles with the vehicle miles traveled. So I think that many people see that as the way to address the alternative fuels and alternative vehicles issue. But certainly I think that they would also look at taxing the actual alternatives, although in the case of an electric vehicle, it's not that easy. But the answer is yes.
Okay. Would a 3-month continuing resolution transfer enough funds to cover the summer construction season? And if not, would Congress have to advance funding from the trust fund collections or add general fund dollars to cover those expenditures?
Yeah, they're going to have to, as I mentioned, it's going to take several billion to deal with the shortfall this year. and then they would need, I guess, about a fourth of 19 billion. So they probably need another 5 or 6 billion for a 3-month extension. So if they do an extension for 3 months, or for 6 months, or for 12 months, if they do an extension like that, they will, I believe, include in that the funds, the shortfall for 2014 as well. So they'll do both. They'll come up with estimates and based on the length of the extension and what they need for this current year, and then that's what they'll put in general funds, and they'll then have to try to figure out what the offset will be that will offset that transfer.
All right. Well, Jack, thank you. Those of you that are from Colorado, when he uses the term devolution, we ought to all cringe with our Tabor limitations that we have in place. So Colorado, even more than some of the other states that Ports to Plains represents, certainly would have a big problem if Congress would go down that road. But we want to thank you for your. Yeah, Jack.
Just let me comment on that. It's quite. I find it quite ironic that the federal government would be saying essentially, well, we don't think we can raise our gas tax 10 cents or 15 cents in order to pay for this necessary investment in our national infrastructure. So what we're going to do is devolve the program to the states, repeal the 18-cent gas tax increase, and then expect all 50 states to politically increase their own fees by more than 18 cents a gallon, because they would basically have to also cover the shortfall amounts to make up for the loss of federal funding. And so the idea that state politicians are going to be able to increase, politically are going to be able to increase their state taxes by an amount that's far in excess of what the federal government would have to raise it, and is unwilling to raise it or unable to raise it, is just, to me, it's almost preposterous.
Yes. Thank you all for your interest. If you have further questions, send them to me at joe.kiley, Kiely, at portstoplains.com. We hope to have the recording of the webinar available early next week on both portstoplains.com and movecolorado.org. And I'll leave you with this. Your active role in addressing transportation funding at both the federal and state levels is critical to our global competitiveness. We hope that you'll stay engaged in the discussion. And again, thank you for attending.